Welcome back. When most people think about gut health, they think about digestion or maybe probiotics, but the microbiome is actually a whole lot bigger than that. Your gut is home to trillions of organisms, bacteria, fungi, viruses, other organisms, and they all interact together. And they influence far more than just digestion. They influence immune function, inflammation, metabolism, even hormone signaling throughout the body. One of the biggest things that determines how resilient that ecosystem is diversity, because healthy ecosystems tend to be diverse ecosystems. That's true in nature, and it's also true in the gut. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Why variety matters and why probiotics are only a very small piece of the picture, and why the environment those organisms live in matters just as much as the organisms themselves. A lot of people think that gut health starts with probiotics, but if that were true, a lot more people would be feeling way better than they actually are. Now, some people take probiotics for years without ever seeing a major improvement. Some feel better temporarily. Some actually feel worse. And that's because probiotics, again, are only a small piece of the picture. One of the problems with modern health culture is that we've started reducing just about everything down to isolated inputs. One strain, one supplement, one capsule. But the microbiome doesn't function in isolation like that. It functions more like an ecosystem that depends on things like diversity, the environment, interactions, resilience. So not just adding more organisms. That's where a lot of the confusions I see comes from. People are trying to force results with those isolated inputs, trying to affect a single area of the body without looking at the overall environment those organisms are living in. So, what is the microbiome? A microbiome is basically a community of organisms living in a community of a certain region. There are different microbiomes, but the one we're talking about today is the gut microbiome. Bacteria, fungi, viruses, other microbes, all interacting together constantly. And they influence a lot more than just digestion. They influence immune function, inflammation, metabolism, and signaling all throughout the body. The important thing to understand is that the microbiome functions more like a system instead of isolated organisms working independently. Now, when we think about this microbiome or this ecosystem, one of the biggest advantages of this diversity in the microbiome is actually resilience. When the microbiome is more diverse, there are simply more functions being covered. Different organisms produce different compounds. They break down different fibers. They help regulate inflammation in different ways. And that actually creates redundancy, meaning if one group declines temporarily for some reason, the others in that group can take over or can compensate for the ones that are missing. And that's part of what makes that ecosystem, the microbiome, that's what makes it stable. A less diverse microbiome tends to actually be more fragile. It's less adaptable, more easily disrupted by things like antibiotics, stress, illness, dietary changes. And it also creates more opportunity for certain organisms to overgrow because now there's less competition. This is one reason why diversity matters more than just having one or two beneficial organisms. So the goal isn't massive amounts of one bacteria. The goal is balance, it's adaptability, it's resilience across the ecosystem as a whole. Now, when this diversity starts to shrink, the microbiome usually becomes less resilient, it's less adaptable, and it's more vulnerable to imbalance. This is where we often start to see things shift clinically. Digestive symptoms become more common, food sensitivities might increase, inflammation becomes easier to trigger, and opportunistic organisms can start taking advantage of the environment. Not necessarily because they suddenly appeared, they were always there, but because the ecosystem lost its balance. You can think of it like a couch, those of you that had teenagers. So you're sitting on the couch in your living room, and your teenage child brings in a bunch of friends, and they're all milling about in the living room, and you decide to get up off the couch to go maybe get you some coffee. And then when you get back, the couch is taken over. There's no more room for you. And that's how you can think of these opportunistic, not that teenagers are opportunistic bacteria, but it's an analogy that works for me. But so this is something I see often when I do GI map or stool testing. Low diversity, lower levels of those beneficial organisms, and then also reduced number of short chain fatty acid producers. Often it's because people are eating fewer unique foods than ever before in order to maybe relieve symptoms, while simultaneously they're also wondering why their gut feels fragile. And a lot of modern life unintentionally pushes things in that direction. Some of that is pretty obvious. Antibiotics can absolutely be necessary, but they also reduce bacterial diversity. And it's not just antibiotics. Other medications like NSAIDs can influence the gut environment as well. And then there's food. Like I already said, many people are eating highly processed diets with very little variety. And the microbiome depends on different fibers and plant compounds to be well nourished. If the diet becomes narrow, the microbiome also becomes narrow in scope as well. And ironically, a lot of people trying to heal their gut end up eating fewer and fewer foods over time. And sometimes these diets can become extremely restrictive. And that may reduce symptoms temporarily, but in the long term, it can reduce that diversity further and aggravate those symptoms in a much stronger way. And of course, stress matters, poor sleep matters, circadian rhythm matters, artificial light at night changes hormone signaling and also affects the gut environment. And so there's the lifestyle side. Many people are indoors most of the day, disconnected from nature, minimal environmental exposure, like digging in the soil or walking out in nature, and then also minimal movement. So all these things can affect the diversity of the microbiome. Our microbiome really evolved in a much different way over, thousands of years. And only in the last 100 years, we changed things so much to where our life is completely different. And evolutionary speaking, our microbiome is just not able to keep up with that. So with those points in mind, probiotics can absolutely be helpful. But it's really important to understand what they actually do. A probiotic is essentially introducing organisms into the gut environment. Some strains help regulate inflammation. Some help support digestion. Some help with bowel movements. Some may influence immune signaling. And so all these different strains do different things. And even within the same species, different strains can have very different effects. For example, people will hear lactobacillus and think of it as one thing maybe. But there are many different species and strains within that category, within that species of lactobacillus, and they don't all behave in the same way. Some may support digestion, some influence immune signaling, and some produce histamine while others help break histamine down. So for example, you have Lactobacillus rhamnosus, which is often used more for immune and gut barrier support, while Lactobacillus reuteri has been studied more for motility and constipation support. So that's one reason probiotics can feel very different from person to person. That's why probiotics are very strain specific. And one product may help one person and do very little for someone else. In many cases, probiotics are more like temporary support than a permanent colonization. Many organisms from those probiotics pass through and create beneficial effects while they're there, but they don't actually establish long-term residence. And that's why probiotics don't always fix a problem, because the environment they're entering still matters so much. You can introduce organisms, but if the terrain is poor, if diversity is low, if the stress is high, if sleep is poor, and the food variety is limited, those organisms may not stick around or function well. You can almost think of it like a garden. When you have a garden and there's weeds growing everywhere, and there's poor soil fertility, maybe there's no fertilizer, not enough minerals in the ground, there's no water coming in because there's a drought like we're having right now, then I can put plants in the garden and nothing, they'll just die. Nothing, they have no benefit just because the conditions aren't right for them. And it's the same thing with our gut environment. So in the end, it doesn't mean that these probiotics are useless. It just means that they're just another tool within this whole concept of gut health. Now, prebiotics are they're very different from probiotics. Instead of introducing organisms, they actually help feed and support the organisms that are already living in the gut. And this is where things like fiber, resistant starch, polyphenols, they all become really important. Those compounds act as fuel for the beneficial organisms that are already living in your gut. And when those organisms, when they ferment those fibers and the resistant starches and the polyphenols, they produce compounds called short chain fatty acids. One of the big ones that you might have heard about is butyrate. Butyrate helps feed the cells lining the colon. So the bacteria makes a compound that keeps the cell in your gut healthy. It also helps regulate inflammation and supports the gut barrier. So this is another reason why food really matters so much. Whole foods contain so many different compounds like fibers, minerals, polyphenols that are all interacting together. So when you look at this screen at the number, the top three things, the fiber, the starches, the polyphenols, you could supplement them or you could just eat whole foods and then you'll get a whole lot more benefit out of them. So, but this interaction really matters. The microbiome really evolved in the context of this real food, which is what we used to eat, in not isolated compounds. The other thing that's really helpful is fermented foods. They can play a huge role here. Things like sauerkraut, kefir, kimchi, yogurt. They can all help introduce organisms and beneficial compounds into the gut environment. Now, they're not magic foods, but because they contribute to the overall ecosystem is why they're so useful. So why do probiotics help some people and not others? There are several reasons for that. The first one, of course, is histamine. Certain probiotic strains can actually produce histamine, and while others may help it break down. So depending on the person, that exact same probiotic can create very different reactions. Another issue is dysbiosis or SIBO. If the gut environment is already imbalanced, adding more organisms doesn't always improve the situation. There are some exceptions. For example, Saccharomyces boulardii can help with diarrhea, even with C. diff diarrhea, but oftentimes when you add probiotics to an overgrowth, it doesn't work out that well. Sometimes it can lead to increased bloating, and it can also lead to abdominal cramping. And then, of course, low diversity matters here too. If the overall ecosystem is weak, adding isolated organisms may not actually create any lasting change. And this is where I think people can get really frustrated. They assume because probiotics are supposed to be good for gut health, but then they don't get any relief because the microbiome is just a whole lot more complicated than that. The terrain matters so much, that environment, it really matters. And the existing ecosystem that's already there matters. So I've seen this with clients that they've been taking probiotics for years and they were still dealing with bloating and food sensitivities and digestive symptoms. And it wasn't the probiotics that were not doing the job. It was the low diversity and it was this compromised environment that they just couldn't overcome that. So, of course, we need to talk about what actually helps create a healthier environment. And you've heard me talk about this many times. The goal isn't perfection, and it's definitely not, um, sterilizing the gut or doing a kill program. The goal is really to build resilience. And when you have that resilient microbiome, it's usually a more diverse microbiome. In the diversity, again, it's shaped by the overall environment. So food variety really matters. Different plants contain different fibers and compounds which support the organisms that are already there. Movement and outdoor exposure. The microbiome evolved in connection with nature, with the soil, with contacting with animals, sunlight, environment diversity. So all these things are very important. Sleep is really important. Circadian rhythm matters. Stress matters as well. The chronic stress can actually change the gut environment and influence the microbiome directly. This is also why I think the modern supplement culture really misses part of the picture. People try to outsource health to supplements while they're ignoring completely all the other things that have to be in play for the gut bacteria to survive. And so all these topics, if you're interested in learning more, we've talked about them in previous lives and previous episodes, so you can go back and look at them there. So I guess the point is that supplements can absolutely be helpful tools, but they really work best when we create the environment for where you can get the best bang for your buck. And then, of course, everybody's microbiome is unique. There's not a perfect microbiome. There's not a perfect number. There's ranges. They've actually done some research and they found that the microbiome in everybody's body is as unique as a fingerprint. Fingerprint is just better, easier to document. But so there is no perfect food list. There is no perfect supplement protocol. There's just the one that would be best for you. Ultimately, the goal is to build a more adaptable and more resilient ecosystem over time. And this is where testing can actually be really helpful to give some context. So I'll show you a GI map test here, and this was actually mine. But we don't want to create an obsession around every little organism, but what we want to look at is the patterns that we see on the page. So the GI map can show a low diversity, it can show us beneficial bacteria, it can show us the short chain fatty acid producers, it can show opportunistic overgrowths, even inflammation markers. And so the important thing here is we're not just going to look at one species of bacteria that's living there, or whether they're high or whether they're low. We're just going to look at the overall picture. And if you look at this picture, you can see that overall it's all trending on the low side. The major phyla are extremely low. And so it just needed a better environment. And I took care of that. This is a couple of years old, so it doesn't look like that now. But that's what we look at. We look at the pattern. We look at, is the diversity low? Is the environment supportive? Are there enough organisms producing all the beneficial compounds? And sometimes testing can just confirm everything that we're suspected and give us a much clearer roadmap. And so we can see why sometimes people haven't improved, even though they already tried a bunch of things. And it can just help us personalize that approach a little more. So the goal is never to chase perfect numbers. It's really just understanding that overarching pattern. So you can see it's not as simple as going to the store and picking a probiotic off the shelf. Now, you might get lucky and get good results, but the microbiome is much more complex than that. It's an ecosystem, and ecosystems respond to the overall environment that they're living in. And that's why food variety matters, lifestyle matters, stress matters, sleep matters, and why probiotics are tools and not like they're not magic. And if you have any questions or any comments, you can just leave them below.